Clear them off the step, all of them. I want it empty by the time my guests arrive." The man who said it wore a gold lanyard the size of a bridle strap, and he said it to Daw the way you would tell a porter to move a trunk. I was 20 feet down the rail, standing my own length of the line, and I heard every word of it because the band had stopped between marches and the whole forecourt had gone that particular soft hum a crowd makes when it is happy and waiting. It was Lantern Eve, the first night of the winter fair, and the city had been climbing toward this hour for a week. And a man in a good coat had just told one of my own to sweep 200 families off the best ground in the kingdom, because he had sold it to somebody twice. My name is Halloran, no relation to the old Halloran of the dueling story they tell at the depot, though I have heard the joke 1,000 times. I have stood the King's Guard at the Aldgate 11 winters. I am not the hero of what happened on Lantern Eve. The man who held the line that night was Private Edmund Daw, the steadiest soldier I ever served beside and the worst talker, and because Daw will never tell it himself, I am telling it for him. I was at his shoulder for the whole of it. I saw what he did, which was nothing, and I have spent years trying to explain to people why the nothing he did was the bravest thing I ever watched a man do at a post. You have to understand the step first, or none of it lands. The lantern step is a long, shallow stair of pale stone that runs the width of the palace forecourt, 6 broad treads rising to the rail where we stand. On an ordinary day, it is just the way the ground climbs to the gate. But on Lantern Eve, when they light the great fire tree in the center of the forecourt and float the lantern boats down the mere, and the band plays the old slow carols the whole city knows by heart, the step is the finest seat in the kingdom. From those 6 treads you can see the fire tree, the boats, the gate, the lit windows of the palace, and the lanterns going up over the river all at once. And here is the thing the gold lanyard did not know, or did not care to know. The step has belonged to the families for 140 years. Not by deed. By something older than deed. The story is that long ago, in a hard winter, the king of the day came out onto the rail and saw the poorest of the city standing in the slush below while the gentry watched the fire from carriages, and he said, "Let the step be for the people. Every Lantern Eve, first come and welcome, and let no man price it. There is no law that says it. There is just the fact of it. Every year the families come at first dark and lay their blankets on the cold stone, and save places for grandmothers and hold sleeping children against the chill, and they have the best view in the kingdom for one night, and it costs them nothing, and that is the whole point of it. My own mother sat on the 3rd tread the winter I was born. Half the men in my company were carried up those stairs as infants to see their first fire tree. It is not a perk, it is a promise, the view that belonged to the people. The man with the lanyard had sold it. His name was Mr. Pell, and he was the director of the Winter Fair Trust, which is a thing the fair had acquired 2 years back when the old volunteer committee got tired and somebody clever offered to professionalize it. Pell ran sponsorships. He had that autumn sold a great many things, the naming of the fire tree, the boats, the band's bandstand, and somewhere in the selling he had promised a tier of important guests, the people who had paid the most, a premium viewing experience on the lantern step, reserved, roped, empty until they arrived, so they would not have to stand among ordinary people on the night they were paying for a kingdom's worth of magic. He had built the rope line that afternoon. Brass stanchions, a velvet cord, a printed card on an easel, reserved trust patrons, and the families had simply walked around it and sat down where they always sat, 200 of them and more by dark, because the step was theirs and a velvet rope is not 140 years of a king's word. And now his guests were an hour out, and the step was full of the people it had always been full of, and Mr. Pell had come to find a man in a red tunic to make the problem go away. He found Daw. I want to tell you what Daw looked like because it matters to the rest. Daw is not a large man. He has a plain, square, patient face, the kind of face that looks like it is listening even when it is only standing. He had been on the line 40 minutes and would be on it 40 more, eyes forward, rifle at the order, the bearskin making him a head taller than he is, the cold coming up off the stone through the soles of his boots the way it does. He gave no sign at all that he had heard Pell. That is the post. You do not turn your head. You do not answer the public. You stand. Pell did not understand that the stillness was an answer. "I'm speaking to you," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice to that confidential register men use when they are about to ask you to do something they know they shouldn't. "I know you're not supposed to chat. I respect that. But this is operational. I'm the director. I run this whole event all right. That area," he flicked a manicured hand at the step, at the families, at the blankets and the flasks and the small faces turned up toward the unlit fire tree, "that area is reserved. Patrons, people who have paid. I need it cleared in the next 20 minutes. You're the nearest authority, so I need you to go down there and move them along, politely, but move them." Daw stood. "You can do the announcement thing, can't you?" Pell went on, warming to it. "The voice. Tell them it's reserved now. They have to relocate, plenty of room along the river. They'll listen to you. They won't listen to me. I've tried. They look at me like I'm—" he made a small, disgusted noise. "But they'll move for the uniform. People always move for the uniform, so off you go." I have thought a great deal since about that phrase. People always move for the uniform. He had it exactly backward and never knew it. The uniform does not move people. The uniform is the thing that does not move. Daw stood. And I watched Mr. Pell's face do the thing I have seen 100 faces do at the rail. The polite confidence curdled. He was not used to being unanswered. Men who run things are very rarely simply ignored, and the ones who have bought a little authority feel its absence worst of all. He leaned in, and his voice dropped the friendly coating. "Do you know who's coming tonight? Do you have any idea? I have people on that list who could buy this fare, buy your barracks, have a word with somebody who has a word with somebody, and you'd be polishing boots in a cellar by spring. So when I tell you to clear the step, soldier, you clear the step. Now." That should have been the moment in the kind of story people like to tell, where the guard says something cutting and the crowd cheers. Daw said nothing. He didn't even blink. The slow part of the band started up again behind us, the carol about the lights on the water, and 200 people on the step began to hum it without knowing they were doing it. And Daw stood in front of the man who wanted them gone and gave him the only thing the post allows, which is the whole of his stillness, and let it mean what it meant. I knew, standing there, something Mr. Pell would never have guessed and Daw would never have told him. I knew why this particular order, on this particular night, had landed on the one man in the company least likely to bend under it. Daw had grown up in the lanes below the mere, the cheap end of the city, the part you don't put on the postcards. His people had nothing, a widowed mother, a house full of younger ones, winters spent deciding between coal and supper. And one night a year, for the whole of his childhood, his mother had bundled the lot of them up in everything they owned and walked them through the cold to the lantern step, and they had sat on the people's stone with everyone else and watched the fire tree light, and for that 1 hour they had been as rich as anybody in the kingdom. It was, he told me once and only once, the single thing in his childhood that no one could take and no one could charge for, the one promise that never broke. He had joined the Guard, I am fairly sure, partly because the Guard was the thing standing at the foot of that step keeping that promise, though he would sooner have eaten his bearskin than say so out loud. So when a man in a gold lanyard came to him on Lantern Eve and told him to go and clear the families off the one warm gift his own childhood had, and to do it because they were poor and in the way of people who had paid, he was, in a manner of speaking, being ordered to evict the boy he used to be. He did not say any of that. He stood. But I have always thought that the stillness Mr. Pell took for stupidity was in fact a man holding the line against something very old and very deep in himself, and winning, the way you win at the post, by not moving an inch while the whole storm of it goes through you. That was when Sergeant Crail came down the rail. Crail had heard it too. Crail hears everything. It is his single supernatural gift. and he came along the line at the slow official walk that means a sergeant has decided to be visible. He stopped at Dawes' shoulder, on the far side from me, and he looked at Mr. Pell with the flat courtesy of a man who has thrown better men than this out of better places. "Can I help you, sir?" Finally, Pell turned to him with relief, an adult located among children. "Yes, are you in charge of these men?" "I'm the section sergeant, sir." "Good, then you can give the order. I'm Director Pell, Winter Fair Trust." He produced a card. Crail did not take it. "I need the lantern step cleared." "It's reserved tonight, patrons of the trust, paying guests. It's all documented. I have the contracts in the office. These people," again the flick of the hand, "are trespassing on a reserved area. I've asked them. They won't move. I need your men to clear it before my guests arrive, which is," he checked a watch that cost more than my year, 50 minutes. "So if you'll just tell your soldier here to do his job." Crail let a small silence sit. He is good at silences. You learn them or you don't last as a sergeant. "His job," Crail said, "is to stand that post and keep the king's peace at this gate. It is not to clear the step. It's a public order matter. It's a lantern eve, sir. The step's full because it's lantern eve. It's full every lantern eve. It's been full every lantern eve since before your trust and mine were a gleam." Crail's voice never rose. "You'll have been told, when you took the fair on, what the step is." "I was told a great many things by a committee of amateurs," Pell said. "I've replaced most of them with arrangements that actually fund this event. Do you know what it costs to float 400 lanterns and light a fire tree 40 feet high? It costs money. The money comes from patrons. The patrons were promised a view. I am delivering the view I sold. That is how an event survives in the modern world, Sergeant, whatever charming traditions you'd prefer." He squared himself. "Now, will you clear it, or do I go over your head?" "You're welcome to go over my head, sir," Crail said, "but not over the families. And my soldier doesn't move them, nor do I." I saw something happen in Mr. Pell then that I have come to think of as the real beginning of the night. He understood that he was not going to get his way by talking to soldiers, and a certain kind of man, when he learns that, does not go away. He goes and gets a bigger stick. "Right," he said softly, "right, we'll see." And he walked off into the lit dark toward the marshal's tent, and Crail watched him go. And then Crail looked at Daw, just a flick of the eyes, and Daw looked at nothing. And between the two of them passed the entire conversation that men who have stood together a long time can have without a word. "Hold the post." "I'm holding it, Sergeant." "Eyes front," Crail said unnecessarily and went back up the rail. "I'll tell you about the families, because they are the heart of this, and because the gold lanyard never once looked at them as people." On the bottom tread, nearest the rail, an old woman named, I learned all this after, Mrs. Tace had set out the same green wool blanket she had brought to the step for 61 years. She told me later that she had come the first time as a girl of 9 with her own grandmother, and that her grandmother had told her, "This is yours, this one night. Nobody can sell you this." She came every year. The blanket had been re-edged 4 times. She was 83, and she had walked from the tram with a stick and a flask, and she had got there at 4 o'clock to be sure of her tread, and she would no more have moved off it for Mr. Pell than she'd have handed him her wedding ring. 2 treads up, a young father I'd watched climb the step at dusk had 3 children stacked against him like firewood, the smallest asleep already inside his coat, the middle one wide awake and waiting for the fire tree with the unbearable patience of a 6-year-old who has been told it is almost time for an hour. The man worked nights, somebody said. This was the one evening of the winter he had with all 3 of them awake and outdoors and free, and he had spent nothing for it, because there was nothing to spend, and that was the gift the dead king had meant. There were grandmothers and apprentices, and a knot of nurses still in their gray from the infirmary up the hill, and a man with a barrow who sold roasted nuts and gave the burnt ones to children for free, and a woman teaching her daughter the words of the Lantern Carol 1 line behind the band. 200 and more, ordinary as bread, sitting in the cold on stone that the kingdom had set aside for exactly them. And then the marshals came. There were 6 of them, fair stewards in orange tabards, led by Pell and trailed by a thin, nervous young man with a clipboard who turned out to be the event's coordinator, a boy named Finch who I think had never been more unhappy in his life. They came down the inside of the rail, and Pell stopped at the brass stanchions and unhooked his velvet cord with a flourish, as though the unhooking made it true, and he lifted a small, loud hailer to his mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please." The crackle of it cut across the band. The carol faltered. "This area is reserved this evening for patrons of the Winter Fair Trust. I'm going to have to ask everyone on the steps to relocate. There is excellent viewing along the river embankment and in the south field. Stewards will direct you. Please gather your belongings and move along now. The steps must be cleared in the next 30 minutes. Thank you for your cooperation." Nobody moved. It was the most extraordinary thing. 200 people heard a man with a loud hailer tell them to leave, and they simply did not. It was not defiance exactly. Nobody shouted. Nobody stood up to argue. They just stayed where they were, the way water stays in a glass, and looked at him, and the father pulled his sleeping child a little closer, and Mrs. Tace folded her hands on the green blanket and looked out at the dark river as though Mr. Pell were a kind of weather. Pell's face went tight. He nodded to the stewards. "All right, help them. Start at the bottom, start there." And he pointed, of all the places he could have pointed, at the bottom tread, at Mrs. Tace and her 61-year-old blanket. "That one, the cord goes there. Move her along, she's right in the patron's eye line." And here is where Daw enters it, because the bottom tread is at the foot of the step, and the foot of the step is at the rail, and the rail is Daw's post. Mrs. Tace, on her blanket, was sitting almost between Daw's boots. A steward came toward her, a decent-looking lad, ordered to do an indecent thing, and you could see he hated it. He crouched down. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to." "I've sat here 61 years, young man," Mrs. Tace said, not unkindly. "I sat here before your director was born. I'll sit here till the fire tree's lit, and the boats are down, and not a minute before." The steward looked back at Pell, helpless. "Lift the blanket," Pell said. "If she won't move the blanket, she'll follow it." And the steward reached for the corner of the green wool, and stopped. Because Daw had not moved, and that was the whole problem, and it was about to become the whole answer. To get at Mrs. Tace's blanket, the steward had to reach in past Daw's boot, into the foot of ground a sentry holds, under the line of his rifle in front of the rail, with 200 people and a gathering crowd of fairgoers watching. He had to physically reach past a KingsGuard standing his post to drag an old woman's blanket out from under her. He looked up at Daw. Daw looked at nothing, eyes level, jaw set, the bearskin black against the lit gate. He had not so much as glanced down, but every man there understood, suddenly, what the geometry meant. Daw was not going to move them, and Daw was not going to stop anyone either. That is not the post. The post does not lay hands on the public over a blanket. What Daw was going to do was stand exactly where he had been told to stand and be exactly what he had been ordered to be by a king a century before this director was a gleam, and let the whole crowd see precisely what it looked like for a man in an orange, tabard to reach past a sentry, and pull an old woman off the people's stone. The steward took his hand back. "I'm sorry," he said to Mrs. Tace low. "I'm sorry, ma'am." And he stood up and stepped back, and he did not touch the blanket. "Phelps," Pell snapped, "what are you doing?" "I'm not doing it, Mr. Pell," the steward said. He was shaking a little, but he said it. "Not like this. Not in front of it." He gestured helplessly at the rail, the bearskin, the crowd, the whole impossible tableau of it. "I'm not reaching past him for an old lady's rug. You want it done, you do it." And he peeled off his tabard, dropped it on the cold stone, and walked up through the families and out, and 3 of the other stewards looked at each other and at Pell and at Daw and followed him. The crowd had gone quiet in a new way now, not the soft, happy hum of waiting, but the held breath of people watching a thing tip. Phones had come up along the back of it. Pell saw them and his face did the calculation that men like him are always, finally, running. How does this look? And he had just enough sense left to know how it looked. A loud hailer. A velvet rope. 6 families deep on the step and an old woman on a green blanket and a soldier standing at his post, not moving, and an event director shouting at his own stewards to lift the rug out from under her. It looked exactly like what it was. That is the moment people mean when they tell the story now. They say, the soldier who wouldn't move. But Daw had done nothing yet that you could point to. He had only stood. The standing was the whole of it. He had taken the one thing a guard is allowed, perfect, total, immovable stillness. And he had aimed it, like the most disciplined weapon in the world, at a wrong, by simply being the wall the wrong would have to climb over in full public view. And no man in an orange tabard that night was willing to climb him. Pell tried once more the way drowning men try the water. He took the loud hailer up again. This is your final notice. The steps are reserved. Anyone remaining will be, and he stopped because he had no end for the sentence. Will be what? Arrested on Lantern Eve for sitting where their grandmothers sat. He had run off the edge of his own authority and there was nothing under his foot. That was when young Finch, the coordinator with the clipboard, finally spoke. Mr. Pell, he said in a thin voice, the patrons' coaches are at the south gate. They're going to walk up the avenue in about 15 minutes. They're going to walk straight into this. Pell turned on him. Then make it not be this, make the steps empty. I can't make the steps empty, Mr. Pell, Finch said, and something in him seemed to settle as he said it, the way it settles in a man who has finally decided to stop being afraid of the wrong thing. Nobody can. There are 200 people and a soldier and I won't be the one in the picture. I told you in October the step wasn't ours to sell. It's in the founding charter of the fair. I sent you the clause. You said the charter was sentimental. He swallowed. It's not sentimental tonight, is it? I have wondered since whether Finch knew Sergeant Crail was standing close enough to hear that, or whether he'd have said it anyway. I think he'd have said it anyway. There is a kind of courage that catches like a fire tree once one spark takes, and Phelps the steward had been the spark, and now it was running up the avenue ahead of the patrons. Because here is the part of the story that makes it the kind I want to tell, the part the niche people would call the system rallying, though it didn't feel like a system that night. It felt like a city remembering itself. Sergeant Crail had, 10 minutes before, sent a runner. Not for soldiers, we never moved a man off the line held all night, that was its own quiet point. He'd sent young Tompkin at the double up to the duty office with a single written line, because that is what a sergeant does when something is wrong that is bigger than a sergeant. He reports it up plainly and lets the chain do its work. And the chain, on Lantern Eve, ran all the way up. The patrons came up the avenue. I'll grant them this, most of them had no idea. They were guests. They'd been told there'd be a fine spot kept for them. They came in good coats with their breath smoking, ready to be charmed. And they came around the last hedge of the avenue and saw the lantern step. They saw 200 families on the cold stone with their flasks and their blankets and their sleeping children. They saw the green wool blanket and the old woman on it. They saw the steward's abandoned tabards in a little orange heap. They saw the velvet rope unhooked and meaningless. And at the foot of it, all they saw one soldier in a red tunic and a black bearskin standing his post, eyes forward, perfectly still, with an old woman almost between his boots. And they understood, most of them in about 4 seconds, exactly what they had been sold and what it had cost. A woman near the front of them, silver hair, a fur collar, the look of someone used to the best of everything, stopped dead. She had a granddaughter by the hand, a girl of about 7 in a red coat, and the girl was staring at the fire tree with her whole face. The woman looked at the rope, and at the families, and at Mr. Pell standing there with his dead loud hailer, and she said, in a voice that carried because she meant it too, "You are going to clear this for us. Madam, the patron viewing area. You were going to move children off a step so I could stand on it. She said it slowly, tasting it. I paid for a good view of the fire. I did not pay to take a child's. I should think not one of us did. She looked back along the line of patrons, daring them, and a low murmur of agreement ran through the good coats, because most people, given the plain choice put in plain words, will not choose to be the villain of it. Where would you have us stand then, since you have so kindly emptied nothing? There's the embankment is excellent. We'll stand at the back, the silver-haired woman said, with everyone else, and we'll be glad of the room. And she walked her granddaughter past the brass stanchions and up to the back of the crowd and stood there, fur collar and all, and the patrons followed her like geese. And just like that, the premium viewing experience dissolved into 240 people watching a fire tree together, which is what it had always been for. But that was not the end. That was only the crowd. The system, as the manuals would have it, had not yet finished arriving. Because Tompkins' note had gone up the chain, and the chain on Lantern Eve led to the controller of the household, who was on duty for the ceremony. And the controller of the household is the man who speaks with the king's voice on small earthly questions like who may stand on which stone. And he came down the avenue at a measured walk with two of his staff, in his dark coat with his white wand of office. And the murmur of the crowd changed pitch when they saw him, because the city knows that wand even if it cannot name the man. He went first, and I will love him forever for it, not to Mr. Pell, but to the bottom tread. He stopped in front of Mrs. Tace and her green blanket, and he took off his hat, and he bowed to her, an old woman on the cold stone, the way you bow to a person who has a right to be where she is. "Madam," he said, "you've sat a long time in the cold. Thank you for keeping the step." 61 years, said Mrs. Tace, who was not going to be out-ceremonied by anybody. "And I'll thank you to light that tree before the little ones freeze." "At once," said the controller, and almost smiled, and turned to Mr. Pell. "I have heard great public reckonings. This was not one." The controller did not raise his voice. That is the thing about real authority. It is the quietest thing in the room, because it never has to prove it is there. "Director Pell," he said, "I'm told you try to clear the Lantern step this evening for paying guests. Is that correct?" "Sir, the trust has the patrons were promised a designated." "The Lantern step," the controller said, "was set aside for the people of this city by the king's own word 141 years ago, and that word has not been withdrawn. It is not within the gift of a sponsorship trust. It is not within the gift of this household. It is certainly not within yours. You cannot sell what was given away in perpetuity for exactly the purpose of never being sold." He let that sit. "You were told this. A young man on your own staff tells me he sent you the clause in October. You called it sentimental." For the first time, something cold came into his voice. "There is nothing sentimental about a king keeping his word for 141 years. It is the most practical thing this kingdom does. It is the reason these people trust the gate they're sitting in front of. You would have spent that tonight for a coachload of patrons who, I notice, have had the good sense to go and stand at the back. The trust's funding. The trust will float its lanterns and light its tree and be thanked, and it will do so on the understanding it had from the day it took the fair on, which is that the step is the people's and is not for sale, now or ever." He glanced at Finch, the coordinator, who was standing very straight. "Your colleague seems to understand the charter better than its director. He'll be running the viewing arrangements from here. You'll go back to the office and find me the contract in which you promised the step to anyone, and we'll have a conversation tomorrow in daylight about what you tell patrons they have bought." He turned, dismissing the whole matter the way you close a door. "Now, the children are cold. And then, and this is the part I tell last always, because it is the part Daw would want told if he told anything." The controller walked down to the rail, to my soldier, who had not moved through any of it, who had stood his post while a director shouted and stewards rebelled and patrons relented, and the king's own voice came down the avenue, and the controller stopped in front of Daw and looked at him for a moment, this plain, square, patient man with the cold coming up through his boots. "Private," he said. "What's your name?" "Daw, sir," said Daw, 2 words, the first he had spoken in an hour. "Daw, you were ordered this evening by a man who believed himself important to clear these people off this step. You declined." "I'm not to leave my post, sir," Daw said, "and I'm not to lay hands on the public, so there wasn't anything for me to do but stand here." A pause. "I thought if I stood here long enough somebody with more right than him would come and put it straight." The controller looked at him a long moment. "That," he said, "is exactly the post. You held the only ground that mattered by holding your own. Carry on, Private Daw." "Sir," said Daw, and resumed looking at nothing, and the cold went on coming up through his boots, and somewhere behind him 240 people had begun, again, to hum the carol about the lights on the water. They lit the fire tree at the proper hour. 40 feet of it all at once, gold and white against the black, and the whole forecourt made the sound a crowd makes when it forgets itself, that long soft "oh" that is the same in every language and every century. The lantern boats went down the mere with their little flames doubling in the dark water. The middle child of the night-working father, the 6-year-old who had waited an hour with unbearable patience, stood up on the 3rd tread and pointed at the fire tree and shrieked with joy, and his father laughed, and the sleeping baby woke and did not cry, only stared, the way babies do at fire. Mrs. Tace watched it all from the bottom tread on her 61-year-old blanket with her hands folded and her chin up, queen of the step, which she was. And Daw stood his post through the whole of it with his back to the fire, the way we always do, never once turning to see the thing the whole city had come to see. People asked him afterward, wasn't it hard, to stand with your back to the fire tree on Lantern Eve after all that, and never look? And Daw, who does not talk, said the only long thing I ever heard him say. "I didn't need to look at the fire," he said. "I could see it on their faces. That's the better view anyway. That's the one I was keeping. I have turned that over for years. I think it is the truest thing anybody said that night, and I think it is the whole of what we are for, said plain by a man who could barely string 2 sentences. We do not stand at the gate to see the fire. We stand so the people can. We keep the view that belongs to them by keeping our backs to it. The reward of the post is the light you never look at, shining on the faces you turned around to guard. There were consequences, the way there are. Mr. Pell did not have his conversation in daylight survive the week. The contract he'd signed, the one promising patrons the step, turned out to exist exactly as he'd claimed, which was the worst possible thing for him, because it proved in his own hand that he had sold a thing that was never his to sell, knowing it wasn't, having been told it wasn't, by a clause sent to him in October that he had called sentimental in writing. The Trust's board, which had been content to let a clever man fund their fare, discovered all at once that they had a charter and a reputation and an old king's word to protect, and they protected them the simple way. They thanked Mr. Pell for his service and accepted his resignation, and they put young Finch, the coordinator who would not be in the picture, in charge of viewing arrangements for good, and Finch's first act was to take the brass stanchions and the velvet cord and have them melted down, and the metal given to the infirmary, which I thought was a very fine thing for a thin, nervous young man to do. The patrons, most of them, came back the next year and stood at the back, and a number of them quietly funded the lanterns out of their own pockets without asking for a step in return, which is the way these things ought to be done. The silver-haired woman in the fur collar, I learned her name. I will keep it, as we keep things, sent a parcel to the barracks in the spring with a card that said only, for the soldier who stood at the foot of my granddaughter's first fire tree, and inside it was a new green wool blanket, the finest you ever saw, which Daw walked down to the tram stop and gave to Mrs. Tace, because, he said, hers was wearing out at the edges and the lady plainly meant it for the step. Mrs. Tace came back the next Lantern Eve, and the one after on the new blanket, and the one after that her granddaughter brought her up on her arm, And the one after that the granddaughter came alone with a child of her own and laid the green blanket on the bottom tread and told the child, "This is yours this one night. Nobody can sell you this." And Daw was on the line that night too, and he told me he heard her say it, and that it was, he said, the second best thing he ever heard at that post. The best, of course, was the controller saying, "Carry on, Private Daw," though Daw would never tell you that. I tell you that. It is the privilege of being the one who can talk for the one who can't. They did write it into the orders in the end. The way these things become real in a regiment is that somebody writes them down. There is a line now in the standing orders of the Aldgate, added after that Lantern Eve, that says no guardsman of this post is to be employed to remove the people of the city from ground given to them by the Crown, and that a guardsman who declines such an order while holding his post in good discipline has done his duty and not breached it, and shall be supported. It is called, among us, the Lantern Clause. New men read it on their first week and don't understand it. They will. One cold first night of the winter fair, with 200 families on the step and a man in a good coat telling them the people don't belong on the people's stone, they will understand exactly what it is for, and they will stand still, and they will keep their backs to the fire, and they will hold the only ground that matters by holding their own. I have stood the King's Guard at the Aldgate 12 winters now. I have seen the fire tree lit 12 times and never once turned to look at it directly, and I never will, and I want you to understand that this is not a deprivation. It is the finest seat in the kingdom, the post at the foot of the lantern step on Lantern Eve, the one place from which you cannot see the fire at all, because from there you can see the people see it. You can watch 141 years of a dead king's word land, warm and gold, on the upturned face of a child who paid nothing and was promised everything. And you can know, standing perfectly still in the cold with your back to the most beautiful thing in the world, that you are the reason the promise held. Daw still won't talk about it. He's a sergeant now, and a worse talker than ever if that's possible. And when the young ones ask him about the night he refused the director, he just says, "I didn't refuse him. I stood my post. That's all the post is." And then he goes quiet and looks at nothing, the way he does, the way he did at the rail that night with an old woman on a green blanket almost between his boots and the whole city watching to see if the wall would move. It didn't move, it never does, that's the whole of it. That's the view that belonged to the people, and the man who kept it by keeping still.